Metal Jesus, I'm back again with an updated game room tour. This is going to be really fun to do. Now, it's been about a year since my last one, and I think I've added about 500 more video games to my collection. Lots of new consoles, lots of new furniture, and I thought, you know what? I'm going to show you how I organize things, how I connect things. This is going to be really fun. Let's take a look. So we're going to start with a quick look around the game room. You can notice that big screen, old school television right there that works fantastic for old consoles. And the latest edition here, which is a stand-up MAME arcade cab. I'm going to cover more in a bit. Now here's the view from the other side, but notice that most of the consoles are covered with these napkins. And I use that because I want them to stay nice and relatively dust-free. I'm usually only playing one console at a time. And I do a mix of these nicer napkins that are pretty cheap at Target and these tubs, these plastic tubs that are cut out. They're notched in the back. And it's a pretty cool mix of stuff to keep your consoles looking nice. I mean, my goal is to only hopefully buy them just once. Now quickly, I just want to mention my stand-up MAME arcade cab. Drunken Master Paul picked this up off of Craigslist. It's an old centipede machine, and we're going to get into more detail about it in the future. It's not quite done, but it's pretty cool so far. Now we're going to get into the specific consoles that I have hooked up and ready to play at a moment's notice. Now I have over 30 consoles, but not all of them are out, but these are. So this is the GameCube, and many people have noticed that I have a Japanese Game Boy Advance player on the bottom of it. There's my latest edition, which is the Wii. Here is the Sega Dreamcast. This is the PlayStation 2 Slim, which also functions as my PlayStation 1 console. I actually have a real PlayStation 1, but I just don't use it very much. I just use this one for both. And here is the Sega Saturn with the Action Replay cartridge in there. Love this console, plays awesome games. And then we swing over to the Xbox. This is the Halo Special Edition, and this is modded so that you can copy games to the hard drive. There is the Retron 3, which allows you to play 3 separate systems. It's okay, not great. And then we come over to the TurboGrafx 16, another console I added this year, and really, really like it. Swinging up to the top of my setup here, I have the Intellivision 3. Very cool console. Just getting into the Intellivision for the first time, so don't really have a lot of games for it. The Sega Master System. I want to get the 3D glasses for this. That's a cool console. And then we have the mighty Colecovision. Very cool. Next up is the Atari 2600 Junior and 7800 next to the Nintendo 64. Here is one of my Sega Genesis. I have all 3 models. Here is the Nintendo Top Loader and the Super Nintendo. Now, one of the great things about everyone switching over to flat screen TVs is that you can often find awesome old school televisions for cheap on Craigslist. This is my JVC right here. Great television. Also in here is my turntable that I often rock out to with actual vinyl connected to my KRK V6 speakers. And those are all plugged into a bank of switches that I can very quickly go back and forth between any console I want. And it all goes through a Mackie mixing board. So you see how I've labeled things here. They're all kind of daisy chained together, but again, the point is you come down to my game room and within a matter of seconds, I can be playing pretty much any console. To try and conserve power, I have this remote control on this power strip down here with all the old school power supplies, and it actually works pretty well. It's kind of nice. It has a light to tell you if it's on or off or not. With so many consoles, well, you're gonna have a ton of controllers, and so I came up with this solution to store them, and basically I keep one of every console in Ziploc bags in this hollowed out end table here, and it works pretty well. Again, the whole point is to try to keep these controllers in perfect condition, or as good a condition as possible, and not have them all grimy and dusty. Now let's start walking through the cabinets. Underneath the GameCube there is where I keep my Atari 5200. All of its connections, joysticks, and games are held there. Now, unfortunately, the 5200 is a little bit finicky, and so I don't leave it out. So I keep it protected down there, and that's where it sleeps. To the right is where my Mackie mixing board is, and then underneath there is where I keep all my loose Game Boy games. I have original Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance. They're all in there and fit nicely. I actually don't have a lot of boxed games like that. And then to the right is the awesome Atari 5200 trackball. Now to the right of this is probably the messiest part of my game room, and this drives me crazy. This is where all the loose, kind of random joysticks end up. A lot of arcade sticks are in here, and things I just don't typically use all the time are kept in this sort of jumble. Over here is where I keep a lot of my Nintendo 64 loose cartridges. You'll notice that I printed labels for the tops there because it's so much easier to try to find your favorite games, including Kirby. Love that game. And below that is where I keep a lot of loose Super Nintendo games. In the center area is where you'll find my PlayStation Portable, which includes a custom Jello skin on there. That's kind of steampunky looking. I love it. And this holder here has all of my favorite Nintendo 64 cartridges, including Mischief Makers and a ton of awesome racing games. Love the Nintendo 64 for racing. Below that is an area I store just kind of random stuff, including TurboGrafx Hue cards, a bunch of games here, as well as a couple CD games and some cables. In here you find a bunch of Game Boy Advance, and another PSP, just sort of random stuff in here, as well as other cables and tools I might need. In this section you find my Atari 7800 collection, some fantastic arcade ports in here. This is actually a really fun console to collect for. Down in this drawer is where I keep all my Colecovision cartridges. Some of my favorite arcade ports are down here as well. I think if you have the 7800, the ColecoVision, and the Intellivision, you're doing pretty good as far as old school 80s games. In this section of my game room, you see some of my Sega CD games, as well as the Sega Saturn games. And over on the end here, there are a bunch of Japanese imports for the Saturn. That's actually where I think most of the cool stuff comes from, is the Japanese imports. Here are my loose Sega Genesis games, along with a couple 32X games and some loose Master System games. Above them is my kind of unusual Pokemon Game Boy Advance that I found at a garage sale, as well as this kind of unusual Zelda Game Boy. Found both of those at a garage sale, and here is my NES collection. Here's my Dreamcast collection, so many great games there. And right above that is the PlayStation 1 games, including a couple rare titles there, Lunar 1 and 2. And more PlayStation 1 games above that. A lot of fun to collect for that system. Here are my PSP games, and the movies are going to be on the right there. You know, I'm kind of surprised, but actually I really enjoy collecting and playing on the PSP. It's a fantastic handheld. Now, the movies, I don't know what Sony was thinking. You know, most of these I got for $1 or $2, and I think that's the most you should pay. But it works really well as a movie player too. My Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 are connected upstairs in the living room to the HD TV, but I keep overflow of the games down here in the game room, and you can see some of the highlights here. Some of my favorites are the Mass Effect, Singularity, you have to play that game. So many great games on the 360. And then here's my PlayStation 3, which doesn't get a lot of love, but the Uncharted games are fantastic, and Heavy Rain was excellent too. Now you may be asking yourself, why does he have Kiss Ducks? Well, my response to you is, why doesn't everybody have Kiss Ducks? Some great Sega Genesis games here, including Truxton, as well as Shadowrun, and also the Phantasy Star games. Really, really like collecting for the Sega Genesis. One of my largest collections is the original Atari 2600, and that's probably because, well, one, I grew up with it. It was my first console, And thankfully the games can be pretty cheap. So you're seeing basically 2 levels here of loose Atari 2600 games. And anytime I find one out in the wild for a reasonable price that I don't already own, I have to add it to my collection. I really like that system. Another console I have a lot of games for is the original Xbox. I really like collecting for this console because the games look fantastic and they're relatively cheap. However, here's a pretty rare title. This is an unopened copy of Conquer. Pretty hard to find. When people ask what one of my favorite consoles of all time is, I have to say it is the PlayStation 2. I just think it's fantastic. There are so many great games across so many genres for this system. And thankfully, I have most of the games that I want for it. There's just so many great games. I love it. Now let's walk around the room and show you some of the decorations, including this Ico cage here I got from Sony years ago. I also recently added this Grim Fandango poster, Atari Age, some Grand Theft Auto action going on there, some of my favorites. Red Dead Redemption I love, and here is some pretty gruesome Dead Space posters, pretty fun. And some original Star Wars posters. I'm a huge Star Wars fan if you haven't noticed. One of my all-time favorite role-playing games is Planescape Torment, and here's a poster for that, as well as some classic Star Wars comic books, Knights of the Old Republic. And just so you know, I'm a fan of the bad guys in Star Wars. Oh yeah. Here's a quick look at my modest GameCube collection. I actually really like the console, and there's some just excellent games for it, including Eternal Darkness. I actually have 2 copies. I love that game so much. Killer 7, Ikaruga. So you don't need to have a ton of games for the system, but there are some gems. And that's a pretty rare and unusual Twilight Princess game. That's the Japanese GameCube version that was only available online, and it's sealed. Here's an area of my game room where I have just some random stuff, including a box of PC Engine games that was given to me by a fan, and some random Saturn games. But up here I have some boxed Game Boy games that are pretty fun, and my latest console, which I just added this week, and so I'm starting to collect for the Wii and trying to find some of the gems that are out there for that system. And I'm enjoying it quite a bit. And above all this, I have one of my gems in the collection, which is an unopened copy of Hero for the Colecovision, as well as an unopened copy of F-Zero. Pretty unusual to find that. In another corner of my game room is where I have my classic Windows XP machine that I play all of my classic DOS and Windows games on. So my game collection is kind of an odd mix of really old role-playing games, as well as DOS sort of shooters and flight sims. And of course I had to have a bunch of Sierra games as well. The Ultima role-playing games were some of my favorites as a kid, and so I have almost all of those, as well as Planescape Torment, of course, Diablo 2, Privateer 2, F-19, Mech Warrior. There's Shivers 2, which was the game that I actually had a part in. I was an actor in that game. 2 pieces of my collection that are kind of rare and you don't see very often are up above, hanging on the wall there. Those are 2 Commodore 64 games, and they're both complete and unopened. One of them is 1-on-1, Dr. J versus Larry Bird, and the other is Sky Fox. Now, I have to admit, like an idiot before I got really serious about collecting, I threw out a bunch of jewel cases for a lot of PC games that I owned and threw the discs in a binder. And while that might be convenient, it kind of makes me cry inside because I wish I had all these in their original form. But sadly, I do not. However, I have hundreds of these games in binders. So it's kind of cool to own the original discs, but I would like to eventually get the original boxes and manuals back as well. A lot of you know that I also play music, and I play with my wife and also Drunken Master Paul and his wife, and we get together about every weekend or so, come down in the basement in the music section here, and we just create a lot of noise. This is a great space for that. We don't annoy our neighbors, and we also throw parties down here. It's just a really great space for that, and you can get as silly and as wacky as you want, so we play a lot of rock and roll down here. So that's a quick look at my Metal Jesus Man Cave, my game room, my music area. So much fun down here. I love coming down here, kicking back with beer and playing some games with my buds. It's awesome. As always, I want to thank you for watching my channel and thank you for subscribing. Take care.